In this episode, we talk about Indian Defence Minister Rajnath Singh meeting his Chinese counterpart Admiral Dong Jun on the sidelines of the meeting of Ministers of Defence of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We also talk about Delhi enforcing a fuel ban on end-of-life vehicles. But we begin today by talking about why, according to the World Bank, India's poverty levels have significantly come down. Hi, I am Niharika Nanda, and you are listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Earlier this month, the World Bank made a rather remarkable claim. It said that just 5.75% of Indians now live in abject poverty. This was a big shift considering that around 13 years ago, the figure was 27%, nearly 5 times higher. In fact, back in April, the World Bank, the renowned international financial institution, had said that over 170 million Indians had been lifted out of extreme poverty in the past decade. The government had celebrated this by releasing a press release titled India's Triumph in Combating Poverty. But how did India achieve this? And more importantly, did it actually achieve this? To understand what these numbers really mean, my colleague Shashank Bhargava speaks to the Indian Express's Udit Mishra.
Udit, because we'll be talking about poverty in this discussion, can you begin by talking about who counts as poor in India and what is the difference between being poor and someone living in abject poverty?
So the first thing to understand is that nobody is counting. These are all estimates. And we do not know per se who exactly is the poor. We are coming to an estimate of how many might be poor.
And is this because this is one of those really difficult tasks, identifying every single person living under poverty?
So poverty in any country has these two problems. One is to estimate what is the level of poverty and then to identify the poor. And identifying poor is a very complicated issue. And we've done that. In India, there have been several reports on how to identify poor because how else, after you've got to know that suppose you have 40% poverty level in India, then what do? You'll have to go to those 40%. Then you'll have to identify those 40%. And therein lies all the problems of, whether there was fraud in the process, whether somebody, gamed the system and all those problems. And so it is a very complicated thing of how to identify the poor. And that is the tougher of the problems than knowing a broad estimate of how many are poor. So the idea behind, say, these poverty levels or poverty lines is largely administrative, because governments want to take care of their population and they cannot obviously help everybody, all 100 people say. So they decide, okay, let us decide a poverty line and anybody who falls below that, we will provide some special care for them, right? So that's how you decide these estimates. You first decide a poverty line and you say anybody below that we'll consider to be poor, and then we'll target some kind of social welfare schemes, free food, jobs, something for them. That's the idea behind it.
And traditionally, what has been this line for India? How has our government decided this?
Right. So the traditional way is that you conduct consumption expenditure surveys. These are surveys, not census, surveys. You figure out how much are people consuming. Then you look at the whole survey data and you say, okay, at this particular mark, whatever that may be, per person, per day number, we say, okay, at this particular mark, we will consider this to be abject poverty. Somebody cannot live below this. So, for example, as late as, say, 2009, when Tendulkar Committee came out with a new proposal, just before Tendulkar Committee came out with a new proposal, the poverty line in India was just 17 rupees a day per person in urban areas and 12 rupees per day in rural areas.
And this is income?
This is basically all income. All told, all expenses, 17 rupees or 12 rupees in urban and rural areas. So the point is that anybody living off less than 17 rupees would be considered living in abject poverty.
Okay, so 17 rupees, that comes out to about 500 rupees per month.
This is 2008. 9 kind of data, which was then when Tendulkar Committee came out with its own recommendations, they raised it to 29 rupees for urban areas and 22 rupees for rural areas. Now, the thing with raising poverty lines is twofold. One is that obviously you have to raise poverty lines because prices keep going up. The other thing is that no matter what you choose as a poverty line will then decide how many fall below it. Now, if you suppose were to say that let's raise the poverty line to 1,000 rupees, a lot more people will be below poverty line and you will have to then give your resources to all those people. So the governments are always looking to figure out what is the level we can really target, the most disadvantaged. So if you had 100 people, it is not about just catching well-being, all these 100, like you could say in argument's sake that all of India is largely poor. We are a poor country as against, say, some Western country. But the idea when you're deciding a domestic poverty line is to figure out who's the most disadvantaged within this country, who can then be targeted through government schemes. So that is the idea in choosing the poverty line.
And Udit, we know that this Tendulkar committee was formed in 2005 and it submitted its report, like you said, in 2009. But could you talk about why was there a need felt to revise the way we look at poverty?
So there are two reasons broadly. One is that, as I said, prices keep going up. So you cannot just stay at the same poverty line because after 10 years, 15 years, inflation eats away in the value of money. The other is to sort of take a fresh look. So Tendulkar Committee also came up with the understanding that prior to Tendulkar Committee, the notion was that let's calculate how much money does a person require to get all the calories in their body. And the abject poor are those who cannot earn enough to get the basic minimum calories in their body. But the notion in that kind of calculation was that the state, India as the socialist state, as a state where government would provide education and healthcare. But when Professor Tendulkar came to head this committee, his argument was that that idea has not really fructified. That whole notion where the government provides healthcare and education and everything hasn't really happened. We had also shifted to the post-planned economy since 1991. So Tendulkar's idea was that let's add those expenditures also, education and healthcare expenditures, to decide who's really poor. And so for both reasons of inflation and for reasons of the fact that you have to include other expenditures, he raised the poverty line.
Okay, so this was in 2009. How does the government decide the poverty line now?
So the last official estimates based on Tendulkar Committee were in 2011-12 and now is 2025. So roughly 13 years have gone past. And typically the update should happen both in terms of inflation. You adjust for inflation if you're not adjusting for methodology. But typically every reasonable period, you should also have a relook. And the government had commissioned, the UPA government towards the end, I think commissioned the Rangarajan committee to look at poverty estimation again. And they came up with a report also, but that was never finally accepted. It raised the poverty line further from Tendulkar report. So from 2009 to 2014, there was a need to, again, increase the poverty line and for different reasons also. So those are, again, more methodological reasons. But since then, two things have happened. A, we have not relooked at our methodology. We didn't even accept the Rangarajan methodology. And secondly, we did not capture our consumption data. Actually, we did capture our consumption data. The survey was done in 2017-18, the same year when employment surveys showed unemployment rising to a 45-year high. Consumption data showed that poverty had increased. The consumption levels had fallen in India for the first time in independent India. And so that showed that poverty had risen. Consumption falling means poverty has risen. And government disregarded that data, saying that it didn't sort of fit in with the guidelines of what the data quality should be. And it was contested heavily by many researchers. But for whatever it's worth, it was disregarded. And so we had a data gap.
And 13 years is a big gap in that sense. Have we started doing consumption surveys again, though?
So now we have started doing it. In the last 2 years, we've done consumption expenditure surveys. But as I said, those are consumption data. To translate that into poverty, domestic poverty numbers, you have to actually sit down and do those calculations. And the other thing that has happened is that the consumption expenditure surveys that are now happening in the last 2 years have a different methodology. So they are not replicable or they are not comparable with the previous ones. And that creates another round of confusion, how you collect that data. So one idea, and this is a kind of criticism that was there with census also, right? I mean, if you change the timing, you change the comparability of it.
And so because there is this gap now, does that mean we can't truly understand the extent to which poverty has increased or decreased in India?
Yes, that is essentially the point. A lot of people who work extensively on poverty data, inequality data, are saying that depending on how you interpret data, how you calculate it, the decline in poverty could be very gradual or could be very steep. So you have, variations depending on what poverty line you choose, what methodology you choose. India's poverty level could be 82% or could be 2%, depending on how you look at it. So that's why at one level it becomes meaningless. It's because of the data gaps and the changes.
And although we started this segment by talking about what the World Bank said, we haven't actually discussed the World Bank itself yet. So tell us, where does the World Bank come in? How does it define the poverty line? And why are we giving it so much importance? Because for years, we've had our own way of estimating poverty, right?
Yeah, so the simple answer why we are considering right now World Bank poverty data is because we don't have any of our. That is the only poverty line that exists for the time being. And the funny thing is that India, its academicians, its economists, and its work on poverty estimation and identifying the poor has been the envy of the world in the past. The World Bank and such organizations actually learned from Indian economists or Indian methodologies on how to actually go about doing this. Somebody like Tendulkar was a leading personality in this calculation. Now, the World Bank's job is much more difficult, more complicated at one level. It is always better for any country to have its own poverty line because you have a clear access to data. World Bank's job is difficult and more complicated because it has to create a poverty line for the whole world. Then there are two kinds of broad problems. One is that over time, inflation changes. So how does World Bank's poverty line keeps getting updated? And, how do you decide who's poor in New York and who's poor in Noida? The other thing is that between countries, there are massive differences. People don't eat the same things, don't access to healthcare and education the same way. Prices are different over space. So the World Bank started in 1985 using the 5 poorest countries and using their prices and their poverty line as the basic poverty line for the world. And that turned out to be $1 a day. And that $1 a day consumption level or income level was not so much the market exchange rate. It was on the purchasing power parity.
So here by $1, they do not mean 85 rupees.
They do not mean 85 rupees. So what the World Bank has gone about doing is that saying that, okay, if $1 a day is the poverty line, we believe in, say, US, then what does that buy a person in US, right? And then use the same basket of goods and services elsewhere and see how much is required. So in today's context, whatever $1 buys in the US can be bought for 20 rupees or 21 rupees in India. So when we say $3 a day is the poverty line for the World Bank, it essentially means around 62 rupees in India, right? And that's the poverty line for abject poverty. Obviously, as I said, you can choose different poverty lines because you're trying to understand what is happening to the society. So if you choose a poverty line of 87 rupees, the number of people below it would be more. If you choose a poverty line of 171 rupees, the people would be even more. In India's case, that number just jumps up quite remarkably. We have around 83% of our population living at less than 171 rupees a day per person.
Okay, so the World Bank has just stated that India now has 5.75% of people living under abject poverty. And based on the World Bank itself, in 2011, this number was 27%, right? So how are we accounting for that change? How is it that poverty seems to have reduced 5 times as much in India, according to the World Bank?
So under normal circumstances, we would presume that, as India continues to grow, economy widens, more and more people will be pulled out of the poverty, the abject poverty level. So the first thing is to understand that this 5.7 or less than 6% number is abject poverty. World Bank itself doesn't use this now anymore for India. For India, it uses a slightly higher poverty line, which is at $4.2 a day, which translates to something like 87 rupees a day. Right? And there the poverty rate is 24%, right? So if you were to use what was considered poor in 2011 and increase the poverty line to accommodate for India's higher increased total income, then the poverty line would not be 62 rupees, it will be 87 rupees. And then around 24% of India would be under poverty. And so this is what I was saying in my piece, that, poverty essentially lies on how you look at it. You could argue that the poverty reduction hasn't happened that much, because what is considered to be, by World Bank standards, the poverty line for India today, because India has become richer, still has around 24% people below it.
Okay, so if the World Bank is not even considering abject poverty for India, so then why is it even stating that, and why are we choosing to highlight it?
Yeah, I think policymakers will always highlight data which shows them in a good light. But I think it's also dependent on the citizens to understand the data for themselves and figure out where the reality lies and what is the truth.
And now we shift our focus to the developments between India and China. Last week, Indian Defence Minister Rajnath Singh met his Chinese counterpart Admiral Dong Jun on the sidelines of the Defence Ministers' meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The meeting took place in the Chinese city of Qingdao and focused on the ongoing border situation between the two countries. You might remember that back in October 2024, India and China had agreed to disengage in eastern Ladakh after a military standoff that lasted for over 4 years. Now, while some progress has been made since then, the two sides are still working towards restoring a sense of normalcy along the border. To break down what was discussed at the meeting, the key concerns raised, and what this could mean going forward, we are joined by the Indian Express's Amrita Nayak Dutta. Amrita, for a while now, we have been hearing that India and China are working towards de-escalation and disengagement along the line of actual control. But what is the current situation on the border?
So, Niharika, since October, when both India and China agreed to disengage their troops from along the line of actual control in eastern Ladakh and kind of arrived at an agreement on patrolling arrangements along the border, much of the issues which came after April 2020 saw some kind of resolution. So, the borders have been largely peaceful since then. India, on its side, has been geotagging established patrolling points and other landmarks on the line of actual control. This is to aid easier identification and demarcation of its boundary with China. And this would kind of enable smoother patrolling by Indian troops and also prevent clashes with Chinese soldiers. At the same time, there is a focus on developing infrastructure, better roads, better bridges, better habitat for the troops who are deployed there. And there's focus on increasing surveillance. There are regular patrolling. There are frequent interaction between Indian and Chinese commanders at various levels. And some kind of readjustment of Indian troops have been happening over there. These are some of the tactical developments that have happened in the area over the last 8 months. However, I would like to emphasize that the area has largely been peaceful. We haven't heard of any incident where Indian and Chinese soldiers have clashed or anything of that sort. So after this agreement on patrolling and some kind of disengagement, things have been largely smooth.
Right, and we understand that Defence Minister Rajnath Singh met with Admiral Dong Jun at the SCO Defence Ministers meet. So what all was discussed during this meeting?
So, Niharika, Defence Minister Rajnath Singh, he spoke of a very particular thing. He spoke of a structured roadmap of permanent engagement and de-escalation. And he also called for permanent resolution of border demarcation. So, this is a new formulation. Usually, India and China, when they have met, they have talked about de-escalation and disengagement, not exactly a border demarcation or permanent de-escalation. So, in the talks that happened last week on the sidelines of defense ministers of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Defence Minister Rajnath Singh, he underlined the need for bridging the trust deficit created after 2020 border standoff by taking action on ground. And there was a statement which said that both sides agreed to continue consultations at various levels to achieve progress on issues related to disengagement, de-escalation, border management, and eventually delimitation through existing mechanisms. So these are some of the things which have been spoken in the last meeting. The previous meetings at the military and diplomatic levels, they have focused on trust building, understanding, confidence building, engagements. But there was no exact talk of a structured roadmap to de-escalation, which is key to the remaining steps for de-escalation.
And just for our listeners, de-escalation basically refers to both sides bringing down the enhanced troop levels to more normal levels as before, thereby reducing the risk of conflict. But Amrita, talk about some of the other things that Rajnath Singh highlighted in the meeting.
So the defense minister, he emphasized the need to create good neighborly conditions to achieve best mutual benefits as well as cooperate for overall stability in Asia and the world. And he also called for bridging the trust deficit created after the 2020 border standoff. He also briefed his Chinese counterpart on the terror attack in Pahalgam earlier this year and the Operation Sindoor, which was subsequently launched by India to dismantle the terror network in Pakistan. So multiple things. Overall, mostly I would say it is about the border issue. There has not been any major activity on the border, but yes, India continues to remain vigilant. And the talks this time was mostly aimed at resolving it further, creating a proper, ensuring delimitation, creating a border demarcation, and also a structured roadmap to permanent de-escalation. Why de-escalation is important? Because India and China, both sides had pushed 50 to 60,000 troops in the wake of the 2020 border standoff, border clashes which happened. So a de-escalation is the thing that remains after patrolling agreements were achieved and everything else was done. So these are the points that were put forth by our defense minister to the Chinese counterpart.
And Amrita, what significance does this meeting hold? And how do we see it impacting the bilateral relations between India and China?
So usually there are bilateral meetings that the defense minister holds with the defense ministers of different participating countries on the sidelines of the SCO defense ministers meeting. So this is something that usually happens. It has happened in the past also where the defense minister has met his Chinese, his Russian and counterparts from other countries. So the government has always maintained that despite unresolved border issues and trust deficit due to the standoff, both sides have maintained dialogue, and that is a good thing that they have said. The latest meeting also seems to have been pretty positive, and it has served as a platform for India to convey its opinion and its points on the existing border issues, which is to achieve full de-escalation and have a border demarcation. So that way, I would say it has had a positive outcome.
And you mentioned earlier how Rajnath Singh also brought up the Pahalgam terror attack during the meeting. Can you talk about that a bit more?
From what we know, he is understood to have mentioned in detail the Pahalgam terror attack which happened, which killed 26 people. And at the same time, he also mentioned in detail about the recent Operation Sindoor that was launched by India to dismantle terror networks in Pakistan. So he mentioned both at the meeting. We don't know the exact details on what other details he mentioned about these, but these are the points that he mentioned practically in every bilateral meeting that he had with the defense minister of another country. So he made it a point to put it out there.
Right, and we understand that India actually refused to sign the Shanghai Cooperation Draft Statement. And that was because of the Pahalgam terror attack, right?
So defense ministers of the SCO, they failed to issue a joint statement after Defense Minister Rajnath Singh. He declined to sign the draft statement, which omitted a reference to the April 22 Pahalgam terror attack in Jammu and Kashmir. So what we understand is while the document, it left out referring to the Pahalgam attack, it had mentioned the hijacking of the Jafar Express by the Balochistan Liberation Army in March. So there was no joint statement issues, particularly because Defense Minister Rajnath Singh, he refused to sign on that document. And the joint statement was not issued primarily because of this reason. And the reason he did not, sign the statement, the draft statement, is because he protested the absence of a common standard for terrorism, because it mentioned the Jafar Express incident while left out the Pahalgam terror attack incident. So which is why he did not sign, and as a result, it could not be issued.
And in the end, we talk about Delhi's fuel ban. Starting today, Delhi will begin enforcing a fuel ban on end-of-life vehicles or ELVs, which include diesel vehicles older than 10 years and petrol vehicles over 15 years. A total of 350 teams from various departments will be stationed 24/7 across all 498 fuel stations in the city to implement the measure. The Indian Express's Sophia Matthew reported that enforcement drive follows orders issued earlier this year by the Commission of Air Quality Management (CAQM) in NCR and adjoining areas, which mandated that ELVs be denied fuel in Delhi starting 1st of July. As part of a phased rollout, a similar ban will take effect in 5 high vehicle density districts, Gurgaon, Faridabad, Ghaziabad, Gautam Budh Nagar and Sonipat from November this year. The rest of the National Capital Region will come under the ban from April next year. Sophia reported that according to internal documents, the enforcement plan will include Delhi police personnel being employed at 100 fuel stations. These will be standalone teams and deployment will be based on fuel station locations and traffic patterns. In addition, 59 exclusive teams of the Transport Department will operate independently at designated locations. Furthermore, 91 joint teams comprising Transport Department and Delhi police officials will be stationed at 160 to 250 fuel outlets. These teams will be empowered to issue challans, with 91 police officers being granted such authority by the Transport Department in 2020. The Municipal Corporation of Delhi will also be participating and will be deploying teams at 100 other fuel stations with the mandate to impound overage vehicles. The deployment plan was approved by the Secretary-cum-Commissioner of Transport Department, shared with the Special Commissioner Traffic of Delhi Police and the MCD Commissioner. In line with the CAQM's directive and National Green Tribunal's guidelines, ANPR camera systems have been installed at all fuel stations. These systems will cross-check vehicle data against the Vahan database, alert station operators, and play an audio message if an overage vehicle is detected.
You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by Shashank, Bhargava and me, Niharika, Nanda. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.